Well, welcome everybody. I'm Professor Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm the convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. It is my privilege today to welcome you all and to host this discussion with Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad. Dr. Fathollah-Nejad is a German-Iranian political scientist focusing on Iran and the Middle East and the post-unipolar world order. He is the author of much-acclaimed book, Iran in an Emerging New World Order, from Ahmadinejad to Rouhani, and produces a weekly newsletter, Iran 1400 Brief, Beyond the Headlines. Ali holds a Ph.D. in International Relations from SOAS, that's the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and was the winner of post-doctoral fellowship at Harvard Kennedy School's Iran project. Ali is a prolific author, a regular contributor to media on questions related to Iran. And it's very fortunate for us to have Ali talk to us about Iran's turn to the east, just as Iran has signed up and joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization after a number of attempts to join SCO. That's a very significant achievement for Iran. It has been pursuing that membership. And it does indicate a significant shift in political thinking and also reorientation of priorities for Iranian foreign policy. Ali is the best person, well qualified to talk about this topic, drawing on his book, which I might mention was published by Palgrave's Iranian Politics series, which I edit. So without further ado, I might ask everyone to mute your mics now and invite Ali to start the presentation. Ali, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Shahram. Thank you for having me. Such a pleasure to be with you. Good morning from Berlin. Good evening to you, all of you in Australia. It's such a pleasure to be with you and to be able to talk about one of the focuses of my book that was published with Shahram's Palgrave series, which is based upon my PhD thesis at SOAS. So what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is just to offer a few abbreviated remarks on aspects that I deem important when discussing the issue of Iran's Eastern geopolitical orientation. And of course, the topical or the recent event that forces us to think about this kind of orientation, Eastern orientation of Iran, is of course, as Shahram mentioned at the outset, Iran's joining of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization after 15 long years. So let me start by talking about Iranian foreign policy and geopolitical orientation. As you know, there was the Iranian Revolution of 1979 had the ambition of to present an independent Iran that is both independent from Eastern and Western great powers, something that was also enshrined in one of the most famous slogans back then. Neither East nor West, only the Islamic Republic. So there was not only a striving to be independent from the U.S. imperial power, but also there was also a tendency to be also independent from any Eastern great power bloc. But of course, over the decades and with the tumultuous history of Iran, things have changed. There was very much a focus on anti-Americanism as one of the pillars of the regime for domestic power, rationales, but also in terms of its foreign policy orientation. And if you look at the various Iranian administrations, you can see different different geopolitical preferences. For instance, we had, under Mohammad Khatami, the reformist president, by the end of the 1990s, you had a tendency to seek rapprochement with the West, whereas with the Ahmadinejad administration later on, the geopolitical preference was clearly geared towards the East. And then with Rouhani, there was also, it again shifted back to a tendency to seek closer relations with the West. And now with Raisi, we have the pendulum, coming back to an Eastern geopolitical orientation. All of that said, it doesn't mean that we're going to talk about a clear preference, a clear orientation. So we do have both in parallel, that is Iran trying to seek good relations, or trying to, or being stuck, let's put it that way, being stuck between its relations with the East and the West. Of course, when it comes to Iran's look to the East geopolitical orientation, there are both ideational and material underpinnings. Ideationally, Iran posits itself to be an Asian country, and as such, it views itself to be a part and parcel of any arrangement that may come out of the Asian continent, also be it security arrangements. This goes back to the Rafsanjani era, this idea that Iran has to really, draw closer to the Eastern great powers. And of course, Iran being a great civilization, hence there is a brotherly connection between those Asian civilizations. And of course, the ambition to form an anti-hegemonic, anti-U.S. kind of alliance within Asia. So all of that are part of the ideational underpinnings of Iran's ambition to draw closer. The material underpinnings have been evolving over the past decades, when we had the kind of nexus that exists between East Asia and West Asia, between energy-hungry economies and Western Asian energy, producers. So this was the kind of material underpinning that was, which is the most important factor behind the kind of rationalizations that are made by those proponents of the look to the East policy in the Islamic Republic of Iran. This also pertains to another issue that I discuss at some length in my book, which is the question of the world order constellation after unipolarity. So the whole discussion whether we are now seeing a fully fledged multipolar order, or are we seeing something in between? And so what I'm explaining in the book is that, first of all, of course, we have this kind of shift of the economic center of gravity from the Atlantic to the Pacific, which is very clear, which has been, nicely worked out by LSE economist Danny Kwa, who really, pinpoints this kind of center of gravity, and it is, quite startling to see this kind of shift from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Yet, the question here is whether this geoeconomic shift of power is translating into geopolitical transitions. And this also pertains to the degree of success of Iran's look to the East policy orientation. Because what I'm explaining in the book, when looking at Iran's experience with this look to the East policy, most notably in the 2000s during the nuclear crisis, is that in fact the very shape of the post-unipolar world order imposes some constraints and systemic constraints, and important ones, upon Iran's potential to really benefit from its Eastern relations. So I offer case studies of the behavior of those non-Western great powers, India, China, and Russia. And I explain that their behavior toward Iran has been a function of their respective ties with the United States. Because what I'm saying is that we do not have a fully fledged multipolar order. What we have is a post-unipolar world order, which I propose to call Imperial interpolarity, which means, so basically it goes back to the idea of interpolarity, which is that the main transactions on the world stage are taking place between poles, between great power poles. And of course, in a highly interconnected world. But I add the imperial to this concept because if you look at sources of power, you do see, for instance, on the economic grounds, that there is a clear shift, as I said earlier. But on other accounts, you see that the United States still enjoys some kind of unrivaled power in the financial and economic, financial and banking sectors when it comes to the world currency. So because of that, because of this kind of unrivaled source of power, the United States was able to impose the kind of sanctions against Iran, and was able also to bind also its Asian rivals to commit to those sanctions at one point or another. All the cases which I can talk in more, in more detail, Russia, India, but also China, they look, of course, primarily at their own interests, and for their own interests, their relationships, their respective relationship with the United States is much, much more important than that with Iran. So this is first observation that there was this kind of miscalculation by some quarters in Tehran about the extent to which the look to the East policy can bring about those benefits that Iran was hoping for, which is, if you look, there is always this kind of strong tendency vis-a-vis the East whenever Iran faces problems with the West. Especially so when there is dissatisfaction over the European role, when Iran, was hoping that the European may be able to balance some U.S. pressure. Hence, since that was disappointed time and again, they pinned their hopes upon the balancing, power of the East Asian great powers. But given this constellation of world power, and given of course the much more important weight of the United States for those countries than Iran has, this kind of calculation or those hopes were not satisfied by Iran, but we can talk about it in more detail. So what I'm arguing is that if you, the kind of world order constellation, first of all, is important to understand that, and here we have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of extrapolating our discussion from an allegedly fully pledged multipolar order. So this is, and this pertains also to a miscalculation when it comes to the foreign policy schools of thought in Iran. If you look at them, you see that those who are mostly advocating for an Eastern outlook do understand the evolution of the international system as one seeing a very clear and decisive decline of U.S. power. Hence, the great opportunity for Iran to join hands with, China and others to really, put a, to give a kiss of death to the declining U.S. power. And so this is the kind of calculation by, let's say, more hardline elements in Iran who are advocating closer relationships with the East, whereas the foreign policy school of thought associated with the Rouhani administration had a much more realistic sense of the international system, although there were also, very much, very much accepting the notion that there is U.S. decline, but they would qualify this decline in a different fashion, saying that although the U.S. is in decline, it can still be, an actor that can very much harm Iran. And also, nevertheless, we still have to look for some good relations with the West, despite this allegedly swift Western decline in world affairs. So this is the kind of also foreign policy school of or the different thinking or an appreciation of the international system by the foreign policy schools of thought in Iran. And last but not least, we also have to talk about the politico-economic underpinnings of this Eastern orientation. So who are the proponents, in other words, of Iran's look to the East within the Islamic Republic? They have traditionally been those close to the hardline centers of power, be it the Supreme Leader Khamenei or the IRGC. And of course, the Supreme Leader Khamenei has been very vocal about his advocacy of this look to the East over the last years and decades. But what is interesting to see is that it is precisely this politico-economic, let's say, power group in Iran that is really seeking closer relationship with China, and that is very much, fearful of the same kind of close relationships with the West. And one of the reasons is that political, that is that they don't have to fear that China, or for that matter, any other non-Western authoritarian great power, is going to table any kind of issues pertaining to democracy or human rights in its dealings with Iran. So this is not going to happen, and this is a sigh of relief for Tehran. And another one pertains to the kind of monopolies that exist in the Islamic Republic of Iran. They too would potentially suffer from a veritable opening up of the Iranian economy vis-a-vis the West, something that is also proponents within some quarters of the Iranian establishment. But with this Eastern orientation, they can hope to safeguard their monopolies. And one of the main, let's say, organs of this kind of Eastern orientation is the Iran-China Chamber of Commerce. And if you look at, the persons there, you see the kind of close relations that exist between the hardline centers of power and this kind of Iran and Iran's look to the East. So maybe I'm going to stop at this point. And so we're going to have ample time for discussion, and I can delve into one or other topics of interest.
Thank you so much, Ali-Jan. You've really opened up the topic quite nicely. There is, as you mentioned, quite a range of diverse perspectives on China and how Iran fits within the broader region. The floor is open for questions. Please use the raise hand function so I know that you have a question. If you don't know where that is, it's in the reactions button. Or you can just wave at me and I will find you. The group is not so big. James has a question. Go ahead, James. You can unmute and ask a question.
Yeah. Hi. First of all, Shahram, thank you for organizing this. Ali, good to see you, and congratulations on the book. I've got two brief questions. One is to what degree was admission or the acceptance of the application to the SCO driven by Afghanistan? Fact of the matter is that, as you know, that Iran has long wanted its application endorsed, and in a lot of ways, the Chinese, maybe to a lesser degree, the Russians didn't want that to happen because of the balance and the fact that admission to the SCO is a unanimous vote, which would have given the Iranians or will give the Iranians a veto when it comes to the Gulf states if they wanted to exercise that. So the question is whether or not, this is this has been accelerated by Afghanistan, and if so, what that means. And my second question relates to Afghanistan also, because that is today, obviously, among many things, but a major foreign policy issue, given the relationship with Hazaras and the mixed record that we've seen in the last 3 months in terms of the Taliban and the Hazaras. Thank you.
Should I start responding to that, Shahram, or are we?
Yes, please, Ajahn.
Okay. All right. So thank you so much, James, for those very important questions. So on the first one, I actually agree with you. So because I also see that there is some kind of relation with the return of the Taliban to Kabul, with the willingness to accept Iran as a permanent member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And my take is that for Russia and China, it seems that Iran could portray itself to be an important future player in Afghanistan, and hence this kind of timing. And of course, I mean, this has been a long journey of Iran joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. If we look back at a decade ago, you see, I mean, very incisive events or backgrounds. For instance, I mean, one of the reasons that the main decision makers in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which are China and Russia, were opposing Iranian membership during last decade's nuclear conflict, was that they told Iran at some point, well, according to SCO rules, those countries subject to UN Security Council resolutions cannot become a permanent member. But curiously, both Russia and China, despite rhetoric to the contrary, were actually, voting for those same UN Security Council resolutions imposed upon Iran, which they fielded as a reason why to not accept Iran as a full member. Hence, there is, and this is also what I talk about in the book, is there is also a sense of hierarchy that is at play here. So with the international system, and those at the topper levels do not want to see an elevation of countries at a lower level. So they want to keep also Iran at bay at some point. But then again, we have to wait and see what all of that will bring Iran. So I mean, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization is not an Eastern NATO, as one as some Iranians may want it to become. So yes, Iran has finally been able to join the SCO, but what kind of benefits it's going to have, it's a totally different issue. On the Taliban question, there was a strong effort by RGC related outlets over the past few months in Iran to portray the Taliban as a reformed entity, and to therefore legitimize Tehran's connections with it, that were also all of a sudden public after the kind of enmity that existed between the two sides by the turn of the millennium. So yes, there has been efforts to somehow whitewash the Taliban from the part of Iranian hardliners in order to legitimize this kind of relations. But whether this is going to play out is a wholly different story. Whether Iran can push for its interests as much as it wants in Afghanistan is also unclear. What kind of consequences it will have on Iran economically speaking. So there are a lot of open questions yet. So the kind of, I think, euphoria that existed in some quarters in Iran about the the swift decline of the United States and neighboring Afghanistan as a kind of, celebration of the ultimate decline of U.S. power is maybe a bit premature. So I'm gonna stop here.
Okay, thank you so much. Now, manager, please unmute.
Yes,
go ahead.
Let me begin by thanking Shahram for organizing this very interesting and timely presentation by Dr. Fathollah-Nejad. And it's also good to see Dorsey again. I have two questions as well. The first one has to do with Iran joining the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in Tehran. It's portrayed to be a turning point, a major watershed event, all of that. I personally do not see it as such. Let's say India and Pakistan joined SCO before, and Iran had an observer position since 2005. They felt that China was snubbing them, and so was Russia. And in that sense, there is a sense of recognition that that snobbery is over, and now we are a full member. But look at relation of India. While it's a full member of SCO, it's full-fledged in the American camp in the Quad against China, and it does much. It's really symbolic. And I don't think, should push comes to shove, and there would be supposedly, and I'm just talking hypothetically, a military confrontation between Iran and Israel, or Iran and the United States, none of the SCO members are gonna risk their neck to jump in defense of Iran. So there is nothing as such going on. And I see it really as more symbolic and psychological at this point, and it has to do with Iran being snubbed. The second point that I have, the distinction that you made between the reformist and the hardliner in regard the sharp turns toward the West and East, I also see a great deal of convergence between the two of them, especially when Trump administration was around. In numerous interviews, Javad Zarif would say his legacy is that he has shored up Iran's relation with China and Russia, and how necessary that relationship is, and especially would compliment China, that your friend can be found during hard times, and China has come to our rescue by taking some of the sanctions, buying some of our oil, etc. So the necessity of Iran's Eastern strategy for survival, I think, cut across factional line in Iranian political spectrum, and it still does. And I still believe that Raisi's administration wants really to negotiate with the United States through JCPOA, because they have come to realize that the relationship with Russia and China, as you aptly mentioned, relations linked to bilateral ties that Russia, China, and India have with the United States, is contingent on that. So if they want to expand even their Eastern strategy, they have to come to terms with the United States.
Go ahead, Ali John.
My question dash comments.
Thank you for that.
Really thank you so much. I mean, the first exposition was a very eloquent one when it comes to Iran's look to the East and its benefits. And yes, I mean, when it comes to foreign policy schools of thought, yes, I mean, there is not a neat distinction. And also, I didn't say that, a specific domestic political faction would support a clear-cut geopolitical orientation. It's a bit more complex here, and of course, there are also, there are elite buddies where both groups are part of, and so yes, there are tendencies by administrations, and there's a clear preference from the centers of power, which is very much to the east, but it also pertains to their own political, economic, and political interests. So yes, the situation is much more complex here. Maybe I'm going to talk a bit about public perceptions, but maybe you can talk about it later.
Yes, go ahead.
No, because I think also public perception is, also important. I mean, there was a lot of, this kind of 24-year agreement that the Iranians signed with China was very much criticized within Iran because even the, people who are, businessmen and part of, official discussions, so to speak, were also reluctant about the benefits that China could bring to Iran because of the kind of experiences they had with their Chinese counterparts over the last 1 or 2 decades. And from the Iranian society perspective, there's a lot of skepticism vis-a-vis this drawing closer to China, because I think Iranians know fully well about the political, economic, and political ramifications of this closeness, that this closeness may bring about, which would stand in contradistinction with their own political ambitions at home. So there is a strong degree of skepticism. The same holds true with the planned 25-year agreement that also Tehran wants to forge with Russia. I mean, on the China front, we don't know the details. Whatever is also on paper may not turn into reality anytime soon. The New York Times number of $200 billion, I think is, quite an astonishing number, but it's not really, very much based on, very clear figures. So I think this is also important to mention that there is a strong degree of skepticism, and which was very much on display during the outbreak of the coronavirus pandemic in Iran, which had a strong, the import of the coronavirus had a strong Chinese connection. The Iranians, despite saying differently in the public, were continuing flights to China at a time when this was more or less clear that there was this pandemic emerging, but because of the political economic interest and the kind of political interest that Tehran has, those flights have been entertained. And once there was criticism from the Iranian media, even on this kind of connection, and the import, the more or less the import of the, the virus into Iran by China, there was rebuttal, strong rebuttal against those journalists in Iran who dared to speak out against Iran-China links. So there was, a lot of pressure involving the ambassador of China to Tehran, where people had to even apologize to him for raising criticism, and of course, the broader point here is that at a time of unprecedented domestic and international pressures, there is a sense that Iran's look to the East is first and foremost an attempt by the regime to seek an outside power that may be able to protect its survival through through any kind of economic also support, but also military security support. Hence the idea that there is great willingness from the regime side to concede whatever is necessary toward achieving this larger goal of seeking, of establishing regime stability with the help of China and others. So I think this is also something that will play, that's going to remain quite relevant when it comes to, on one hand, the Iranian state's tendency or interest to seek closer relationships with Beijing, but on the other hand, Iranian society's reluctance and skepticism vis-a-vis this development, not only on, let's say, the civil society level, but also among the technocratic class. But there might be a difference here now between 20 years ago and now, because whereas the Iranian technocratic class was lamenting about Chinese products being, omnipresent on the Iranian market after the Europeans had to withdraw from that Iranian market because of US pressure, So there was a lot of talk that basically Chinese, products or cheap products are destroying the Iranian, domestic producers and so forth. But now with developments in technology, I think this particular aspect could be subject to change. So that, this is something that we have to wait and see, but I'm just saying that because of the technological advancements that we've seen over the last decades, this perception that China is basically the actor that is flooding the Iranian market with cheap products might also be subject to change.
I see that Philip has raised his hand. Go ahead and unmute, Philip.
Hello, thanks very much, Ali. I have a question from oddly enough in Baghdad, and that's where I'm sitting at the moment. And my question doesn't really, it could relate to the events of this week, which were certainly noisy at one point and have dominated an enormous amount of media and, political and political science commentary from all over the place. But my question really is, in your remarks, you've indicated a debate in Iran about maybe, just how, let's say, East or Western orientation, the judgments about direction, responses, the role of, their strategic intent with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and so on. When you do your assessment work, how do you apply your lens of data? So you've got raw data, and then you have, say, secondary interpretation, then you've got your analysis. How do you feel?
Philip,
yeah?
Excuse me, I don't see Ali anymore. Ali seems to have dropped off.
Well, I shouldn't have said Baghdad. I shouldn't have said Baghdad, should I? There's just too much going on, really. You never know. You just don't.
Let's just take a second to pull. Casey, are you in touch with Ali to see if he can come back?
I'm trying to now.
Okay.
Yeah. I saw that he was breaking up just a little while ago. Oh, here he is.
There we go.
Oh, okay. Ali?
Is he there? Hang on.
Okay, yes. Ali is back. He'll come back. Okay, Philip, go ahead.
All right. Okay. Well, the question was, in the analysis of Iranian diplomatic and strategic direction, looking east or looking west, or membership of various organizations such as the SCO, in your work, Ali, you've got the raw material, the data that you yourself can read, direct information. You've got secondary information, which might be other analytical thinking, general commentary, Iranian media, for example, and then you've got your analysis. How do you feel the robustness of interpretations of internal Iranian diplomatic strategizing? Is the robustness, reasonably strong, and people's guesses and speculations have proven reasonably correct?
That's a good question. I'm going to turn to Ali and ask Ali to reflect on how robust is Iranian analysis of regional events in relation to Iraq or elsewhere.
The question was pertaining to Iraq or?
But generally, it could reflect. Yes.
Oh, yeah. So, what we can say in general is that, we can divide the foreign policy discussions into various schools of thoughts. Thought that I also did in my PhD, drawing upon the work that was done by Fahri and Lotfian on their categories of foreign policy schools of thought in Iran, be they on the regional arena or on the global arena. When it comes to when it comes to Iran's Eastern geopolitical orientation and the question of Iran's relationship between the East and the West, there's the distinction that I was talking to about earlier, the different appreciations of the evolution of the international system and the extent to which we can see U.S. Power decline. So there is a strong, I think, gulf between what can be called, more the defensive realists associated with the Rouhani administration that see both the East and the West somehow important to Iran, but they do regard Western relations much more important because they argue that still the West is much more advanced in a lot of fields in today's international system, so that we cannot ignore them. So we have to, seek closer ties with them. Whereas another school of thought that might be called offensive realists are more or less, very much have a clear-cut Eastern orientation. And of course, you have, so in terms of analysis of the international realities upon which such a geopolitical orientation could be built, there are differences between various groups of thought in Iran that may also have politico-economic roots. So this is also interesting to see what kind of material foundations actually there is for people to argue for a specific geopolitical orientation. So this is also something that has to be talked about, and I also mentioned it in my book as a kind of need to research it further, because we do not have this kind of open debate that we have in India, for instance, about the geopolitical orientation of India. And so what we definitely need one in Iran, I think, to have a very frank and frank discussion that could also serve national interests and not only regime interests. But of course, there are hurdles to this kind of open and frank discussions when the supreme leader is very much the one that is very strongly advocating for a clear-cut, a brotherhood with China, so to speak.
Clearly, as you mentioned, Ali, the ideological constraints on analysis do frame the kind of analysis that's taking place in Iran, and it do present perhaps barriers to some outlandish or radical ideas. So that's something to always keep in mind. Thanks for highlighting that. There is another question. I see Arash has raised his hand.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. My question is, considering Iran is located within Mackinder's heartland and Spokesman's rimland, can we consider Iran's policy, the eastward outlook, a continuation of the same policy that Qajar and Pahlavi had, i.e. a relation with northern neighbor, Tsarist Russia, Soviet Union, or Russian Federation, and another country outside of the region to keep the balance of power? Is that a consideration? It can be considered that.
Maybe briefly to this point. So first of all, I'm not a historian, so I'm not really able to, respond to the question on the Qajars and the Shah. But when it comes to those classical geopolitics notions that you mentioned in terms of the heartland and the rimland and so forth, it's extremely popular in Iran. And the theoretical framework of my doctoral dissertation and of the book is actually critical geopolitics. So so I try to question those orthodox classical geopolitical notions and concepts, which are very much, very prominent in the Iranian debate, also within among scholars to this day, where they're using this to portray the kind of huge potentials that Iran has, or Iran being a natural kind of ally to various anti-hegemonic powers, so to speak. But the reality is that, you cannot, I think it is misleading to base one's analyses on those orthodox geopolitical notions, because the reality is also very much, shaped by politics in nature. So you would not, necessarily could be arguing that so if you look at the problems of this potential being, being satisfied or being, if you look at the problems, you see the problems with this classical geopolitical, notions. For instance, why is it that India did not, join Iran, or supporting Iran, or why China did not do so? So I think what we really need is to move beyond those classical geopolitical notions that talk about the north-south corridor and the east-west corridor, and all of that is correct, and it has some material underpinnings. But the question is, to what extent did those developments actually go, and why didn't they go as far as they should have gone for years and decades? And what were the obstacles actually? This is much more interesting than to have this kind of, which is very prevalent in the Iranian sphere, to have this kind of self-confidence that is based upon those geopolitical notions that can be, in reality, be quite abstract.
Thank you so much, Alijan. There is a bit more time, and I want to relate this. I have a question myself, and I want to relate it to a question in chat from Zakia Yazdanshenas. She is asking, how does China perceive Iran's regional role in Central Asia, especially after Iran's membership of SCO? But I also want to add to that, a precursor to that question would be, how does Iran see its championship of Muslims globally in relation to the Uyghur population in China, when it is looking east and is practically overlooking and ignoring the Uyghur plight? So how does that, yes, if you could just reflect on that dilemma of ideology and realist foreign policy making.
Well, I mean, most Muslim majority countries in the world have ignored the Uyghurs' plight. I think the only exception might be Turkey. It's depending on the periods. But for sure, the Islamic Republic did ignore them. And of course, I mean, this is a huge contradiction to the kind of ideological ambition that the Islamic Republic has to act as savior and protector of Muslims worldwide, not only Shias, but also Muslims worldwide. And of course, there is strong silence from the Iranian side because of the kind of interest that the regime fears could be undermined when voicing those criticisms. So I think this is the first part of the question, or the other part was?
That's a question from Zakia Yazdanshenas on how China views Iran's role in Central Asia.
Yeah, so maybe, so to that I cannot really comment, but what I can say is that if you look, so the question is, or the larger question would be, how does China view the importance of Iran? I think for non-Western great powers, especially Russia and China, that are at odds with the United States, Iran can be a useful creator of problems that it can field in their relationships with the United States, and as a kind of spoiler, as a kind of headache for US, for the United States. So this is the usefulness of Iran on many accounts. Yet both powers are also not interested to see a nuclear-armed Iran. So this is, they're also not interested to see a fully fledged war. But then again, the question is, are they interested to see any kind of normalizations of relations between the West and Iran? And the probable answer would be no. For sure, a red line or a, quite, negative development would be if Russia would see the total relief, the total removal of US energy sanctions that could, place Iran in a position to compete with Russia over European energy supply. So this is something that the Russians are not interested in seeing. They don't want to see a whole new, the entire US sanctions regime collapsing on Iran. So there are elements within it that are quite important to Russian interests. So there, and for China, the Chinese have been benefiting from Iranian oil supplies over the last, decade or two at a preferential rate. So they too have been able to benefit from the position of weakness of Iran. And they would also halt their oil imports from Iran after Trump announced maximum pressure, right? So this is also, not that what Tehran wanted them, to see. So those, and India, of course, I mean, Professor Duraj mentioned it, the kind of security links that exist between Washington and New Delhi. And the same was true during the Bush era, when the when the George W. Bush administration was offering New Delhi, a closer military cooperation with the United States. And the concession that New Delhi had to offer was in 2006 at two crucial votes at the IAEA against Iran at the Board of Governors that would de facto pave the way for the transfer of the Iranian dossier back then to the UN Security Council. So quite an important step. And for that, the two Indian anti-Iran votes were indispensable. And it was a product of US coercion that was stated by a US diplomat back then. Yes, the realities are much more, conflictual here, and yeah, and of course, there's been also diversification of Chinese energy supply from the entire Persian Gulf region, away from Iran. So this is also important. So. I mean, China has good relations with Iranian foes on the other side of the Gulf, also in terms of energy cooperation and energy supplies. So yes, Iran is important for China, but there is a huge gap between how, the importance, given to China in Iran and vice versa. Because there is no more important state for Iran's international relations for the Islamic Republic of Iran than China. But of course, not the same is true with China's, views on Iran. So this is also, also benefit. I mean, this diversification of energy supplies is also important to look at.
Thank you so much, Ali-Jan. This is all we have time for. You have given us such an extended, and I can see just one person joining the group right now as we wrap up. So thank you so much. Obviously, Iran's foreign policy is very complicated. It's very involved. There are so many different moving parts. The combination of ideology, realism, external pressure, sanctions, all of those come into play. And you've really given us a really balanced and insightful presentation on the topic. So we do thank you and appreciate your time. And I personally hope that your book enjoys significant review and sale. I'll have a stake in the success of your book, Ali.
Thank you so much.
Before I finish the session, I'm happy to share an exciting news also that Deakin University's program in Middle East and Islamic Studies has been named as Australia's Deakin as a lead institution in Australia for the second year running. And that is to a large extent due to the work of everyone at Deakin University, working in the field, and also the various events that we host, and our amazing speakers like Ali Fathollah-Nejad today. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you for your contribution. I have shared the link to our Middle East Studies Forum in the chat. By all means, check our website. We will be having other events, and you can be informed of our upcoming webinars and events. Hopefully next time in person. Hopefully next time we talk, Ali-Jan, we can host you in person, offer you tea and coffee, and show you some Melbourne hospitality.
Thank you so much, Ahmadinejad. Congratulations on your achievement. with your group. It's really, it was a pleasure being with you. Thank you so much for the very good questions. I'm sorry not to be able to respond in detail to all of them. But last but not least, I think suffice to say that in terms of the topic, Iran needs both good relations with Western and Eastern great powers. So it's neither nor, but rather both and. And for that, it needs to get rid of US sanctions, because those US sanctions are inhibiting the kind of potentials that Iran could reap from its Eastern orientation. So the US sanctions are still very much the complicating factor here. So yeah, thank you again so much, Shahram Jun, and also to the others. Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. And those of you in Australia, good night.
Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.